Once again, coming into this beautiful moment. Here at the Zen Cowboy in Bayfield, Colorado, we take another breath. And so for the Zen Sermon today, we're talking about mastery of thought, and we're going to be covering a couple different teachings than we covered a few months ago when we previously went through this. And for those of you just joining in for the first time today, we go through the 9 living peace tenets in a cycle. So we go through mastery of thought, then next week will be impulse, then following will be emotion, and so on and so forth until we come to the final one, which is release self. But it's not a ladder. It's a circle. And so once you get to the end, you start over, because if you treat this as like a mission to accomplish, you're really doing a disservice to yourselves, because in our Western mind, we always think, just one thing leads to another, but then you never really go backwards. And so a lot of times that leads to forgetting the teachings, and we're not really embodying them. We're just fulfilling our ego's desire to learn. And then it feels accomplished. Then you pat yourself on the back, and then you move on to the next exciting thing in life. Doesn't work that way. If you really want to develop a lasting inner peace, this is something that you learn to apply all 9 tenets at the same time in your life. And that is no small feat. It takes time. So we learn them in a progressive system, but after you kind of get a base understanding of them, what then happens is you start to learn how to incorporate all 9 of them at the same time. And then you revisit them on a daily, regular basis, which it can lead to quite the awakening, can't it? Mm-hmm. It literally does lead to inner peace if you consistently do the effort and the work that goes behind it. And so with that disclaimer, mastery of thought, let's take a breath in. So this is cool. The little sheet I'm using today as a reference, this is actually a sheet that is in the student packet that I give to students. And so for people who really want to go deep into this work, I do have a student program. It's 7 months. And we use the chakra system as the base. And so for example, we use the root chakra and the fear and the trust that goes with that. And we combine it with mastery of thought, which, interesting thing, thought is a building block of reality. And so it's fun that we start with the root chakra. So you combine that grounded awareness with mastery of thought so you can create this fantastic base for yourself. And then we progress from there. For example, the next one is the sacral chakra, which that is about pleasure. And also it can lead to a lot of addiction, codependency, guilt, all these fun things. And isn't that funny that it ties in with mastery of impulse? So learning how to handle your impulses no matter what's going on in your life. So it's just really, really cool program. And so this is just, I'm using the cheat sheet for that we really dive into in the program. But to start with mastery of thought. In short, our thoughts sculpt our reality. Thus, we learn to master them and become the observer behind our mind. We direct our thoughts versus them controlling us. Perception is fluid. So if you have something to write down, I'd love for you to write down just the idea that perception is fluid. If you don't have anything to write down, just repeat that a few times in your head. Perception is fluid. Perception is fluid. Perception is fluid. Perception is fluid. And let's breathe that in. So every single one of us suffers because we forget that teaching that perception is fluid. Because something happens, triggers us, and then we start to develop a hard opinion or idea about it. And it is our hard ideas and opinions about life that makes us suffer. If you really think about it, say something shitty happens at work or something in your family that causes pain. It's a very uncomfortable initial experience. But how many of us keep reliving that scenario again and again and again and again? And we often have a negative perception about it. Or maybe we're not even so much negative about it, but we're just resistant to it. We just push it away. And so what we're happening with that is that we are fixated on a certain degree of perception within our own being of what we decided that scenario to mean and to be. And a lot of times, it triggers something within our, quote, self, capital self, our idea of personalized self, that it is frictioning up against, or it is frictioning up against what we think our idea of reality should be. So if it's a family member that's causing you suffering, chances are you have an idea of who you think they should be and how you think they should be behaving, or maybe even how you think they should be well off. If we're concerned with the well-being or the happiness of someone, we have this idea and we look at them and it is different than the reality that we want in our head, and we suffer. So that happens a lot with external stimuli, and it could be family or even just the world as a whole. Anything that you look out on the world, you're seeing it contrary to what you want it to be, and therefore you have a negative thought about it. And when you think about it, it causes you stress, anxiety, fear, anger, whatever the hell, all those fun emotions. Internally, who has self-judgments? All self-judgments are just fixed perceptions, and they're fully bullshittery. That's a fun word. It's true, though. You just have an idea about yourself that you believe to be true, and it causes you pain. But because of said experiences that you've had throughout your life, all of your experience reinforce it. But truly, your experiences reinforce it because you probably weren't aware of the idea of law of attraction, way back when. And so you've had this strong idea. And when you have a thought or belief about something, it changes your words and your actions. And depending on your words and your actions, it changes your behavior. And your collective behavior changes your life choices. And so whether or not you believe in the metaphysical law of attraction or you just believe in psychology, both are equally accurate in explaining how your perceived identity of self leads to all of your life choices henceforth. And if you have a shitty perception of self, you're going to suffer and you're going to keep repeating the same patterns, versus if you have a happy perception of self. But if you have a self-inflated perception of self, you're still going to get yourself into a lot of pain. So really the goal is to release self and to develop that inner peace. Does that make sense? Because when you have inner peace, it doesn't matter which direction your life goes. You are just happy to be alive. You see the gratitude and the beauty of this life. And a lot of times what leads to so much suffering is that we are attaching to some external belief system or person in our life that told us how we should be living and what it means to be happy. And you need to accomplish X, Y, Z before you can relax, before you can be happy, before you can feel love and all these fun things, before you can be saved if we want to go the religious route. And so it leads to a lot of guilt. It leads to a lot of shame. It leads to a lot of anger. It leads to a lot of resentment. It leads to all these things. And all of it is pure mental perception. Even political and religious groups that hold amazing amounts of power, it is still just an idea that we as a group of people have agreed upon. But we think because everyone else believes it, that it's fixed and that it just is what it is. And that was one thing ever since I was a little boy. I would always ask my parents, why is this the way it is? They say it's just the way it is. And I'm like, I disagreed with that. And so I sought my own answers, and that's what led us to this point.
So can I ask a question, because I'm struggling with this? I get what you're saying about perception, it's mental perception in my own personal life. But as a clinician and a diagnostician, I have people pay me to have that perception, to put the symptoms together and give them that diagnosis.
Absolutely.
I have to do that for my job.
Yeah.
That's how I pay my mortgage.
Absolutely.
And though as a diagnostician, that's a perception based on putting puzzle pieces together that add up to what a diagnosis is.
Mm-hmm.
And people's lives depend on that.
Yeah.
It's like being a doctor.
Oh, yeah.
We depend on what their perception is and believe and trust that that is right.
Correct.
Because we have to.
Correct.
I mean,
so how to bring those two things together.
Yeah.
Absolutely, no problem. So let's go on that. So I'll just reiterate. And so go ahead and share the question, just a short little bit.
So the question is, perception is, it's a mental state and it's not fixed, except for that when you're diagnosing as part of your job, it has to be.
Mm-hmm. Correct. And so what you're brushing up against is reality. So the reality, you're pointing out reality to people, and you're a professional reality pointer outer, if that makes sense. You're not a professional perception pointer outer. And so in the moment they're in pain and they're in suffering, or they have been for a very long time. And so you're making sense of their pain and putting a word of it. And it could be any word, it doesn't matter. But in that moment, you're speaking more about reality than perception. Because in their reality, whether or not they've created it for themselves, which if we've beaten the same drum for a very long time of misery for a lot of our lives, we know that it does lead to misery, very real physical symptoms in the future. Not always, sometimes there are things from birth, but a lot of us really do. We have a really rough situation early on and we beat that drum, we beat that drum, we beat that drum, we beat that drum, we beat that drum and we haven't had tools. And so it does lead to these major mental or physical issues in the future. But at that point, they're now that person's present reality. And this teaching of just saying it's all in your head doesn't help. So they need people like you to be that middle anchor that says, okay, this is what's going on and this is how we're going to help heal it. But if you slowly bring in some of these teachings, not for everyone, but for a lot of people, if they learn that they do have a lot more power and they do have a lot more control, that they can start to understand that a lot of their amazing amounts of suffering stems from their attachment to ego, their attachment to self. And so that's when you start to bring in these teachings. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Absolutely. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Thank you. So let's breathe that in. Excellent. So let's see real quick. Let's go ahead. There's a lot of directions I can go in, but let's talk about, we mentioned this a couple weeks ago on Wednesdays. For those of you who've not joined us on a Wednesday yet, they're quite delicious because we go even deeper and a lot more group discussion. So there's the three fires of Buddhism. Buddha taught the three fires. And this is really important to understand with the mind because these are the things that really lead to suffering. And it's one of the noble truths that talks about what is the cause of suffering. Well, it's these three fires. And if you want to write this down, the three fires are greed or desire, or greed/desire. And the second one is delusion/ignorance. And the third one is destructive urges. Or you could even just say anger, but it could be internal anger or external anger. And a lot of time the internal anger, like for me, my anger as a child manifested as depression for me. I never wanted to blame anyone else. So I just carried all that anger onto myself and it really developed a lot of fun things for me. And so we have the three fires of Buddhism. So let's talk about that. Greed and desire. Anytime you're grasping for these external things, funny how it goes into aspects of ego that we covered last week. Anytime you're grasping for these things externally, you're going to notice that there's a lot of disappointment in your life. And you're going to notice that all these things that you're grasping for are always just momentary, temporary satisfactions. And then you get it, you like it, but then you want more. Or you notice that it doesn't last. And then you might, what's the word I'm looking for? Can't find it, but that's okay. When a cave collapses in on itself, implode. You might implode on yourself and break down into a puddle. We've been there. Or you might just instantly jump on that next thing, that next shiny thing that says, okay, maybe that's where my satisfaction is going to come. Maybe that's where my lasting love is going to come. Maybe that's where my lasting whatever is going to come. And that idea of greed or desire of wanting more and more and more and more and more just leads to a lot of suffering. And then you have ignorance, and then you have the delusions. And that's kind of what we were already talking about today with when we get caught up in our mindset of a fixed perception. And if you have a fixed perception, you just say, this is the way it is, and this is the only way it will be, you're going to cause yourself and a lot of people suffering. And when you just develop an idea or a negative opinion about yourself or others, you've completely fallen into ignorance. You have completely fallen into ignorance, aka not knowing, because now no new information can come in. That's why when we wear these robes and when students take their vows, one of the hardest vows for them to take is to release all opinions. They can have preferences, but it is their job, especially when you wear the black robe, it is your job to be able to go into any situation and not have an opinion about it. Because the moment you have a really hard opinion that's coming from your own personal bias, you effed things up. And you can't hold space for the other person because all you're going to be looking at is that person through your eyes rather than being able to look at that person through their eyes, but also the collective world's eyes, or if you're religious, God's eyes, and all these things. But when we already have who's ever met someone in like the first couple minutes and then you develop an opinion about them? And you're just like, well, that's who that person is. Woo, that's rough. And then you limit. But this is also valid for yourself. Who has opinions about yourself and your strengths and your weaknesses and all these things and your issues and all these things? And how much does it keep you trapped in that ability or non-ability to show up and doing something? And then we have anger, we have the destructive urges, and Buddhism, they might even say hate here. really for most of you in this room, you probably are not struggling with hate, because it's one of those rarer things that is not too big of an issue. We think that it's an issue, but really it's not an issue, because a lot of the hate that you're seeing on our planet, especially right now in the United States, is actually ignorance. It's fear-based. It's coming from misunderstandings. It's not hate. Hate is when like you actually have a loved one and then something happens to them, and then you lost your love. Love, or rather hate, is the opposite of love. And so if you don't already have that love thing and that taken away, then you're probably not going to have hate. And so if you say, oh, I hate this certain group of people, and you've never even met one, that's not hate, that's ignorance. Does that make sense? And so I just want to put that disclaimer out there. 2,500 years ago, when these teachings really were first coming around, there's a lot more violence. And again, I'm not saying that there isn't a lot of violence on the planet. Just right here in the United States, in our day-to-day, you walk outside, you can walk down the street and you're fine. So you're going to be running into ignorance out there, people. Anyway, short disclaimer there. It softens the word. It softens the word. So we have destructive urges. Who's ever had a destructive urge that led you into harm? Either self-harm, or maybe your words that harmed someone else, actions that led to some very combustive situations, belief systems that led to some combustive situations. And again, these destructive urges really stem from you're holding tight. You have an idea that you really want to hold on to. And so you go into, it's like instead of going to battle with like physicality, we're going to battle with our mind and our words. Who's had a battle of words with someone before? And it leads to harm. It leads to self-harm. It leads to other people's harm. I love to view the tongue as a blade, and it cuts deep. And so that's why it is so important, as we previously mentioned, when we wear the robes, that we release our opinions, because it's often your opinions that get into trouble. And then these opinions that get into trouble really start to misuse your tongue, and you start to cut things. You start to cut people. Or maybe your little fingertips. That might be better because you're typing things online. That's the 21st century version.
Someone like you, it wouldn't matter how sharp my tongue was, it would never work with you.
Ah, correct. Yes, at this point. So for those over here, do you want to repeat?
You want me to say that again?
Yes.
I'm an old guy, I can't remember.
Don't worry, we can say it. And so, yes, so saying that for someone like us, the words probably wouldn't hurt no matter what someone would say, which is a valid point. I would say probably, 95% of the time at this point. There's still a small percentage. I think by the time, like 40 years from now, really getting it down. But absolutely, and there have been situations, even presently, that have manifested where so many people were upset at it, but then we're just like, that's okay. Even though it happened to us, everyone else was more upset about it than we were. And so that's the beautiful thing, and that's the thing that we can't always hold perfectly because we're still human, but we do our best. We do the best that we can to really show up and to show you all that it is possible to embody it. Granted, we're still learning, but at the same time, it's pretty cool, isn't it? It's pretty cool. So let's breathe into that. Thank you. Excellent. So when you release your anger, when you release your opinions, your delusions, when you release your desires, what ends up happening is you really do start to develop a deepening peace. And when you start to develop that deepening peace, then any of these external waves, these external storms that are coming your way, it's okay. You're not in resistance to them. And so they don't really, you've learned to bend with the wind rather than resist it and then break under the pressure. And so you're no longer really bothered by the world. There's a Zen master, there's a Zen teacher that said something along the lines of, the student said, "Master, how can I be like you? You have so much inner peace." And then the master said, "Do you want to know my secret? Do you want to know a secret?" He said, "I don't mind what I don't mind what happens. I don't mind what happens. So whatever happens in the world, I don't mind." Because he understands the yin and yang principles of just the ebb and the flow of life. That's a little bit of Taoism for you. That all empires rise just as they all fall. Just as the ocean comes in and then it recedes. The ebb and the flow, the moon, the sun, there's this natural polarity, not duality. Duality is when we add our own judgment to it. But there is an inherent polarity on our planet. And our suffering stems from wanting things to last forever and to look a certain way. And unfortunately, that's not how this world is designed. And it's unfortunate because this world can be paradise for us. But the reason it's not paradise is because we keep trying to hold things to be a certain way, and we'll even go to war over them, rather than just recognizing that there's this, everything has its season. And when we can flow with that season, if we develop a culture, our society around that idea of everything has a season, we're going to naturally flow and evolve into the next thing, rather than constantly holding on in fear of what was, that then leads us into very aggressive acts of violence, not only towards the world, but also even just in your home. Because who's had abuse in the home before? Or maybe some of us have accidentally become the abuser. Maybe not physically, but some of us definitely have verbally before and emotionally. And again, we're learning to take away the shame and take away the guilt, because if you're carrying that guilt and shame with you, then it leads you into further abusive situations, further abusive behavior. But when you learn to have that self-acceptance and acceptance towards the world, it starts to clear out all that funkiness up here. And you're able to really just sit and exist. And I'm sure there's some Zen masters that would just say, anytime you have these three fires manifesting, just sit your ass down. If you feel the urge of desire, if you feel the resist of the destructive urges, if you feel the delusion coming on, whatever it might be, sit your ass down in zazen and meditate for a while. And don't get up until you have a little bit more clarity there, because you can't hurt anyone if you're sitting. And you can't hurt yourself if you're just sitting. Just make sure the snacks are over there and you cannot get up. You just sit on your hands like this. That's the sound Snow Angel, our dog, makes when she surrenders. It's quite cute. So let's breathe that in. Okay, I'll conclude. There's much more I can go into, but I want to keep this a shorter video. So we'll conclude with something I teach in Living Peace, the mental overlay effect. The mental overlay effect. And again, we've already talked about it, just without calling it that. But life itself is neutral. Everything on the planet is neutral. Just step out of your duality of right and wrong, good, bad, all that morality just for 1 minute and just look at the life. Maybe just remove humans for a moment and look at the earth. It's easier to see it as neutral in that way, right? Yes, there's still death, and there's the cycle of illness, and predators are eating prey, and we might judge that as bad, but remove that and just realize it's all part of the natural cycle. Neutral. Now add humans in. A little bit harder to keep the neutrality, because as humanity we've added on to the polarity and added duality. And duality is morality. And morality is such bullshit, because it's ironic that we use morality to keep ourselves from doing, quote, bad things, but in actuality it leads to so much worse things, because with morality comes guilt and shame and all those angry fun feelings, because we're not in acceptance. And we have this idea of what is right and what is wrong. And I can tell you what, the people who try to do the most right thing often end up hurting the people the most. So many of the wars on the planet have come from the idea that it was the right thing, especially when you add in some religion into the mix. And a lot of it has stemmed from religion. People don't realize that. There's even times, people don't know that this in Europe, that there's hundreds of thousands of millions of Christians killing each other just over the version of Christianity of what was correct. People often just think of it as outside of Christianity going to war, but it's actually in Europe. For whatever reason, we don't really talk about that here in America during those times, how many people were slaughtered on the same end of the fence. Fascinating. And it was all done in the idea of righteousness. And so we still have, all of us have that still within us, to where we get into our own righteous belief about what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, and we feel like we have to be the savior in that moment. And the truth is, all of that is a mental overlay. And so a mental overlay is when you have a belief system, when you have an idea, and you blanket the world with it. So think of like throwing a blanket on the world, but it's like a colored blanket that is see-through. And so you use a pink blanket and you cover the world with it. Now everything you see is hued with pink. Maybe it's green. Everything you see is hued with green. And what that means is that use religion, use politics. If you identify as something, you are then only going to be able to see through that filter, and you just screwed yourself. That's the challenge with labeling yourself as something. Maybe let's take it to a personalized aspect. If you view yourself as a victim in some way, everything you're going to be seeing is through that lens of that victimhood. Some of you may have experienced that before you had that self-acceptance, that self-love. And it's almost like once you put that down, you walk outside, everything's different, but everything's the same. It's very confusing. Mm-hmm. And you can breathe. It's like this weight was lifted off of your chest. And so the mental overlay is so important to understand that you're doing it. Because if we don't understand that we're doing it, then we are lost within it. And that's why meditation practice, mindfulness techniques, the goal is not so much to just sit and, get over your shit. That's not very helpful, because then you're just going to have other shit to deal with tomorrow, and then the next day, and the next day, and the next day. That's a superficial layer of handling these teachings, is when you have a problem and then you look to rectify it. But then another problem's going to happen, then you're going to rectify it, and another problem's happening. The real thing that you want to get back to is removing the overlay. Really understanding duality, really understanding your own morality. And a lot of times you don't have to go extreme, with world problems. Just use it with your family and use it with the people that you're surrounded by and anyone that you're in judgment of. And rather than saying, how do I accept this person? Change it to, okay, I see within me that I'm having this judgment, and really it's not about that person. If it was anyone in that situation, I'd still be judging them in the same way. And so what is this core belief I have about reality? Change it from person to core belief about reality, and you're working on the mental overlay rather than on the superficial layer of just person to person to person, situation to situation to situation, versus actually it's a full belief I have about reality. And that is what's causing this pattern to manifest again and again and again. So let me break it down. Let me bring it back to point. Deep breath. So the mental overlay. Life itself is neutral. And then you add humanity, and you add morality, and you add duality, and you develop there's a right and a wrong and a good and a bad. And you start to create a division. And then you blanket that division onto the planet. And you stop seeing people for people. Instead, you might just see Democrats, you might see Republicans, you might see Christians, you might see Muslims, you might see Buddhists, you just might see anyone of any culture, of any religion, of any political group, or any group that it just, oh. And so you're no longer seeing the person, you're just seeing the forest, you're no longer seeing the tree. And that's really, really important to understand, that every single person, yes?
That's what a diagnosis does.
Mm-hmm.
It takes away the variety, the spectrum.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we zero in on the issue at hand, and then we can treat it. Whether it is the delusion within ourselves, the anger within ourselves, being able to help someone else, we're able to see the tree. And then we can rise back out and see the forest, and then we could go back in and see the tree, because it's important to see both of them. Does that make sense? So breathe that in for a moment. Very good. So let's take a breath. Let me gather my thoughts and see how we're going to bring this home. Excellent, excellent, excellent. So mastery of thought in a nutshell. Most of life itself is a projection of what we believe to be true. Most of life itself is a projection of what we believe to be true. Most of life itself is a projection of what we believe to be true. And it's the perception is fluid. And when you can fully actualize that within your being and not get lost in your opinions and your ideas, then you're able to be fluid with that perception and to really be able to master your thoughts and change them on a dime, rather than get them so fixated on one thing where you go down rabbit holes of despair on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. We've all been there, I'm sure. And that's really just another word for neurosis. Pick that scab, pick that scab. Pick. And so our job with the Living Peace Code, starting with the first one, you can't do the other 8 if you don't get this first one. Now, don't let that stop you from reading further in the book, because they all work hand in hand, so you can read through it, but then go back and really dig into mastery of thought and understand the illusions of the mind and our belief systems, and how these two things work together to create the foundation from which we present ourselves in the world and we project our ideas out onto the world. And how, in truth be told, that we can really just take all that mental energy that we're exuding outward and bring it right here and keep it internally and only use it intentionally. Deep breath. And we learn to use it intentionally once we finally get to the 9th tenet, which is release self, because as long as you have a very hard idea about yourself, it's going to be very hard to fully show up for other people. Not impossible, but we become so much more effective at it. Deep breath. Excellent. Concluding this video, I want to thank those of you watching at home. And as always, there's some links down below that you can find for our zencowboy.org website, our Patreon with blogs and other videos, and all sorts of fun stuff down below if you want to be more in connection and to learn more. And for those of you who might want to learn the teachings on a one-on-one basis where we work together a few times a month, that'd be awesome. Please view more on the website. Thank you so much, and we'll see you.